Good afternoon. I'm Sunghyun Park, Vice President of Shinhan Financial Group. I'm in charge of strategy and sustainability at Shinhan. Also, I'm a member of the Asia Pacific Banking Group of this year's UNEP FI's Global Steering Committee. Welcome to UNEP FI's Regional Roundtable's high-level session on net zero policy of Korea, and I'm very excited about this session. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, many of the environmental groups and financial institutions from the region could not attend the roundtable in person. But still, I hope this session will help us have a more in-depth discussion with a focus on Korea. The topic today is Korea's net zero policy and the actions being taken by local financial institutions. We will address some of the difficulties FIs have in implementing their net zero strategy and shed light on how to overcome those difficulties. We have with us the leading practitioners working in the sustainability field in Korea. Let me introduce our speakers. First of all, we have the Director General Han-seung from the Ministry of Environment. Hello, I'm Han-seung from the Ministry of Environment. Next, we have Mr. Sang-chun Han, Chief Writer from Korea Economic Daily. Hello. And we have Managing Director Jin-young Kim from KB Financial Group. Hello. Finally, we have Mr. Tae-young Lim, UNEP FI Korea representative. Thank you all. First of all, I'll ask Director Han-seung from the Ministry of Environment. Could you please give us an overview of Korea's net zero policy? Yes, as you're well aware, in the second half of last year, the Korean government declared its net zero goal. Net zero is not about reducing emissions 20% or 30%, which used to be the approach that we used to have. It requires making a shift to a completely different concept. So after the net zero declaration last year, the Korean government is currently working on specific scenario as to how to achieve net zero by 2050. Our goal is to complete the scenario by June and develop sector-specific implementation strategies, for example, for transportation sector and for building sector, etc., by the end of the year. And once the sector-specific strategies are set, then we will have to revise the existing set of carbon-related policies developed prior to the net zero policy. For example, we will amend the basic energy plan or the basic plan on electricity demand and supply in line with the new net zero strategy. So that's what the Korean government is doing right now. And as soon as the overall scenario and sector-specific strategies are prepared, we will begin to see a huge transformation taking place in Korea. So the government is taking action and making an all-out effort now. But my question for Mr. Sang-chun Han is that how is carbon neutrality being received by the Korean society in general? This year marks a very important year for environmental issues, and therefore it's a very meaningful year. Personally, I myself participated in the negotiations related to the Kyoto Protocol as a private sector representative. And this year, there is a new Biden administration in the US. And the previous US government was believed to have made setbacks in its environmental policy. By contrast, one of the first executive orders signed by the new US President Biden was to rejoin the Paris Agreement, and a climate summit, albeit on screen, was successfully held. Very meaningful series of events. So I'm all the more happy to see that we have gathered here today for this invaluable discussion. In fact, we are faced with many problems today. Like President Biden, we also need to consider the environmental issue from an ethical point of view. This issue is a bigger problem than nuclear weapons, given the huge casualties caused by extreme weathers, such as droughts, floods, and tsunamis. So the environmental issue has become a very ethical issue for humanity, and it is very important for us to have a practical point of view about this issue. So governments around the world will, of course, try to prepare their own policies, but the environment is a public good. So it has to be addressed by a universal body like the United Nations. This is also the thinking of President Biden. So we need to take this issue very seriously. What's important here is implementation. CO2 gets accumulated over time. It's not a passing phenomenon. So, in terms of implementation, the potential conflict between the US, which used to be the largest emitter, and China, the current largest emitter, is the biggest obstacle, both in the pre and post Kyoto Protocol era. Indeed, environmental challenges are on the top of the agenda of the Korean government, and also it's a real concern to the general public. To give you some context on the implementation of government policy, first off, Korea's presidency is limited to a single 5-year term, which makes it hard to ensure continuity of policy. Ensuring continuity of policy is key to implementation, and it can lead to real benefits for the citizens. The current administration is aiming for net zero by 2050, but if we look at its industrial policy and the nuclear exit policy, there appears to be a mismatch or inconsistency between the goal and the means that the government is trying to use. So, a lot of confusion on the side of the private sector. Without a strong consensus built, I'm concerned that policy may change with the change of administration, and this problem has been pointed out in the media over and over again. So, in this meaningful year, the government needs to understand this basic problem exists if it is serious about making real progress. Focus today is on net zero finance. So, may I ask KB, the leading financial institutions, to say a few words? Hello, I'm Young Kim, Managing Director of KB Financial Group. KB Financial Group identified decarbonization as the highest priority in achieving net zero. So, in September last year, we became the first financial group in Korea to declare a shift to decarbonization of finance. But we were a bit worried at the time because with the declaration of decarbonization, we had to give up on coal-fired power plant business, and we were not sure if we really had to do away with it because it seemed to me and to the company that it was a huge loss for our business. But in fact, declaration of decarbonization of finance actually worked in our favor. It opened doors to new business areas such as eco-friendly business, and it helped us to communicate our net zero commitment inside and outside of the company. And on top of that, it created a good chance for us to earn trust from our stakeholders. The board of directors championed our decarbonization declaration, and finally, today we have become the first Korean financial institution to declare decarbonization of finance. Secondly, with the declaration, KB decided to discontinue project financing or bond underwriting for new coal-fired power plants. And in February this year, we joined the Equator Principle and put in place a rule that KB will no longer participate in large-scale development projects with high potential for environmental damage. In April this year, a banking alliance for net zero was formed under the wings of the UN. It's called Net Zero Banking Alliance. KB Financial Group and Shinhan Financial Group became signatories to this alliance. To give you more background, Net Zero Banking Alliance was formed under the leadership of Mark Carney. He is the financial advisor for COP26, which is scheduled to be held in Glasgow in November this year. So financial alliances were created, which includes banking alliance, insurance alliance, securities and asset management alliance, and it is the banking alliance that KB and Shinhan have joined. And the members of the alliance have agreed to achieve net zero of their asset portfolios of both their lending and investment. So the member banks are required to review and report their progress every 5 years, and they have agreed to share what they have accomplished every year. So we are making various efforts like this. As far as I know, Shinhan Financial Group declared zero carbon drive at the end of last year. Could Shinhan please explain about that? Yes. Regarding our approach to carbon emission, we first thought about our own emissions, just like the industry in general. We use a lot of electricity. This is because the bank's data center consumes electricity equivalent to the amount used by a city of 50,000 people. So our initial approach was to reduce emissions generated by our own business. So we announced our vision called Eco Transform 2020, and then we joined various initiatives including TCFD. And particularly after joining UNEP FI, we learned about PRI and realized that cutting emissions from our own business was important. But what was also important was that as a broker of funds, a financial institution should make investment or lending decisions in a way that helps maintain low or zero emissions from industries. For instance, we emit about 90,000 tons of carbon per year. However, 11 million tons of carbon is emitted by the companies we are lending to. So the question is, reducing 90,000 tons is necessary, but how to reduce these 11 million tons is more important for Shinhan as a financial institution. So in November last year, we announced our net zero target. And after Korea declared its net zero goal in October, Shinhan has a total investment or loan portfolio of 600 trillion Korean won. When we say that we will make carbon emissions to zero by 2050, it means that companies that are emitting carbon in 2050 will not be able to receive any investment or loans from Shinhan. This is not just a story of domestic FIs, but some global FIs have declared that they will achieve net zero emissions by 2040, which is even faster. Meanwhile, we took the first step, and fortunately, many other FIs in Korea are following suit. Recently, we embarked on a zero carbon drive. Basically, it is the concept of net zero. Net zero is the same thing as carbon neutrality. Net zero is a goal to reduce the amount of carbon we emit through eco-friendly projects or afforestation, thereby reducing our carbon emissions to zero by 2050. But the criteria for offsets or reductions recognition are extremely stringent. We have to create a zero carbon portfolio by 2050, and the key here in the process is to be able to quantify and objectify our reductions. It is not enough to claim that we made the measurements at our will and made it to zero. It must be recognized by SVTI or Science-Based Targets Initiative. There are also a number of ways to measure the amount of carbon emitted by the companies in our book. Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials of the Netherlands has a very advanced method of measuring carbon emissions. Applying this technique, we are designing everything with the goal of reducing emissions by 38% by 2030, 70% by 2040, and net zero by 2050. Thank you for sharing Shinhan's targets. Carbon is a global public good, so it is very important to establish global standards for green. There can be many problems when the level playing field is not guaranteed. Could you please explain how the metrics can be defined in the absence of international agreements? In the Netherlands, there is an organization called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, or PCAF for short. In fact, there are no international standards as of yet, and the Netherlands is leading the way because the Netherlands has the most eco-friendly financial companies, and that's why they are taking the lead. So, how do we measure the carbon footprint of the companies we're lending to? In the case of a steel company, for example, you need to measure the amount of carbon they actually emit per ton of steel produced. You have to make an assumption and estimate how much carbon is emitted for a ton of steel produced. So as of now, PCAF is recognized as the most scientific and objective method, and CDP is also acknowledging the Dutch standards. So there is an increasing number of institutions being affiliated with PCAF. There are no international global standards as of yet, and voluntary global standard initiatives are just coming out with financial institutions flocking to the most credible one. So we have also joined the PCAF mentioned earlier, and KB and other financial institutions will all join soon. It is likely that one day an official certification authority will be created by the UN or another global organization. Until then, we will have to rely on voluntary initiatives. Yes, in fact, in March of this year, we also joined SVTI and PCAF that you just mentioned. The difference between these two initiatives is that SVTI is an initiative that provides a baseline when setting targets to reduce carbon emissions, and PCAF is an initiative that provides a guideline or methodology for achieving those targets. These guidelines came out at the end of last year. The most recent one is the PCAF methodology. KB is working on advancing its risk management system in line with this methodology. So, for example, what is the amount of carbon emissions from our asset portfolio? What industries are emitting carbon? How much are they emitting? And how do we adjust our portfolio at some point in order to achieve our targets? So, we are working on a management strategy to address these questions. I asked this question because what I had seen in the past is that recommendations, if not properly implemented, they're not effective, they're not legally binding. As consistency is key in responding to the environmental issues, it's critical to have laws and regulations in place. The problem with voluntary initiatives is that there's no penalty for non-compliance. This was also a critical flaw with the Kyoto Protocol. From this perspective, what we need to consider is whether these initiatives will be able to evolve into legally binding instruments. Unless implementation is ensured, things can fall apart very easily. That's why I asked you this question. Since we are financial institutions, everything is linked to what the financial regulators are doing. For example, it's my understanding that the guideline for the management and supervision of climate risk is set to be announced by the end of the year. and there will be a draft issued by the end of the year. That's our understanding. And next year, the Basel Committee will notify the regulatory ratios to the financial supervisory authorities. If that happens, of course, we will do simulations and testing on our side, but if the management and supervision guideline is to be issued, it may not be legally binding, as you said earlier, but what this means is that in 3 to 4 years' time, it is very likely that there will be active supervision by the financial regulators taking place. I have a question for Director Kum from the Ministry of Environment. Even if companies take action voluntarily in an era where state power is ahead of corporate power, government guidelines are absolutely needed on these kinds of issues. Even if the private sector leads the way, if the government does not follow it and support it, the private sector can do only so much with their voluntary compliance with the international community's recommendations. When looking at the current government's energy policy from this perspective, the private sector is leading the way and moving toward international agreements, but the current administration seems to be trapped in the Galapagos syndrome on the environmental and CO2 issues. Then, even if the private sector strives for carbon neutrality based on a sense of crisis, it cannot go further if the government is blocking the way. What's your opinion on this? Since the focus today is on finance, let me tell you from the financial perspective, things have changed a lot. 10 years ago, when the government's Green Growth Initiative was launched, green finance was also part of it. But at that time, it didn't really take off and just disappeared. But now the framework has shifted from green growth to net zero. It's been upgraded, so to speak. And there are a lot of things that the Republic of Korea misses. For example, in the past, when the issue of regulating ship fuel was raised at the International Maritime Organization, Korea did not take any action right away, saying that, hey, there's no legally bounding regulation whatsoever. But suddenly, IMO made a decision. IMO's decisions immediately take effect as international regulation. So ships that fail to meet the ship fuel regulation were not allowed to enter any ports. So there was big bewilderment in the industry. The same goes for this. The framework of green finance has shifted now. For example, TCFD does not have any enforcement power, but the contents discussed there are reflected in the policies and regulations of central banks and financial supervisory authorities around the world, and then they directly affect the financial institutions in Korea as well. Therefore, the Ministry of Environment, FSS, and FSC are closely working together. For example, in the case of emission trading, only spot trading is allowed in Korea, but futures and options are all available in the European Union. So we are also encouraging financial institutions to participate in these new types of trading. The biggest challenge before was the lack of clear definition of what constituted green for financial institutions. So we are now working with the FSS and FSC to create K taxonomy or green classification system. Based on this, you can determine which economic activities can be classified as green. The reason finance is so important is that regulation alone is not enough to deal with greenhouse emitting companies. After all, funds and financing is very important for companies because profit maximization is their top priority. So, what standards do we need to make sure money flows into low carbon activities? This is what we're trying to do with K taxonomy. We're currently working on a draft, and if completed after expert consultation, it will accelerate the development of green finance in Korea considerably. Also, if I may add, the government has the most information on various climate risks, such as information on greenhouse gas emissions. But how can financial institutions use and take advantage of this information? what's the right format of data for financial institutions use? Can those data be processed to fit the purpose of financial institutions? To answer these questions, we're doing a policy research on what kind of information, reports, and guidelines are needed to respond to TCFD. I think the outcome of the research will be very helpful. Let me further elaborate my answer to your question, Mr. Han. Initially, environmental disclosure strongly relies on voluntary disclosure. It is about voluntarily disclosing information on the environmental policy of a company or a financial institution, information on its risk system and carbon emissions from its asset portfolio. And in the next phase, it becomes mandatory disclosure. Once enough data is accumulated through mandatory disclosure, then it becomes a regulation. Korea is at a stage where it is transitioning from voluntary to mandatory disclosure, and Europe is moving from mandatory disclosure to regulation. About Net Zero Banking Alliance that KB mentioned, you said there's no penalty whatsoever for non-compliance. In fact, we have to submit an annual report to the Alliance for the next 5 years, and we must follow the comply or explain rule, under which members must comply or they must explain in detail why they cannot comply. So there's this rule. The reports we submit are made available to investors worldwide. In this sense, we could say international standards are being formed and strengthened. What's more important than law is that for financial institutions, investors are a key consideration. For example, just as BlackRock declared that it would not invest in companies that do not apply ESG, the transfusion of funds is a very important factor for financial institutions as brokers of funds. Therefore, if investors cannot trust, then it's a very serious situation for us. So even if there's no regulation or law, financial institutions have no choice but to follow the trend for various reasons. There are many aspects of ESG that are subject to external effects, and climate change or climate risk in particular can be internalized by market mechanisms like emission trading or carbon tax. This is why regulators around the world are particularly keen on climate change among all the ESG issues. With the need for net zero in finance gaining ground in Korea, from 2 to 3 years ago, pension funds and insurance companies started to declare decarbonization of finance one by one. And this year in April, 113 financial companies joined in declaring 2050 net zero and endorsed climate finance. These developments indicate that going forward, ESG, or more specifically, internalization or institutionalization of climate risk, will be further accelerated. Mr. Park, Vice President of Shinhan, mentioned net zero of the asset portfolio, right? For a financial institution to achieve net zero of their portfolio, it should be able to identify risks in all industry sectors, which seems to be a daunting task. How are you going about this difficult task? Yes, as was mentioned by Mr. Han from Korea Economic Daily, if only one or two financial institutions step forward and pursue net zero, they may end up losing their customers to their competitors. Therefore, there needs to be a more stringent institutional framework at the early stage, at the initial stage. Right now, the Korean Federation of Banks, or KFB, is leading the effort to develop best practice guideline. Of course, authorities like FSC and KFB understand that the guideline is just a guideline. It's not legally binding as such, but still, if you're complying with it, if you're not complying with it, you must explain why. So these voluntary guidelines are coming out in Korea. right now. So, what is most needed at the moment is data on green activities or green data. It's a big challenge for us. Shinhan or KB may ask their borrowers to provide the relevant data, but if they just do not agree and just switch to another financial institution, then there's nothing we can do about it. So, obviously, to deal with ESG issues or climate finance in particular, financial institutions are not competing with one another. They are partners. They have to work together to create an environment where provision of climate data is a must for getting a loan. But Korea is not there yet. So we are doing a lot of customer engagement to incorporate carbon emissions in our loan assessment process, just like KB is doing. For instance, we will consider ESG factors in our credit rating of individual companies. In other words, we will consider carbon emissions, human rights, and other non-financial factors or ESG factors of a company in our credit rating in addition to financial factors. Shinhan's investment assessment risk management system will be all set by the end of the year. Once the system is ready, we will ask our customers, give us your emission reduction plan, what's your current emission level. You have to reduce this much in order to extend your line of credit. So we will intensify our customer engagement in this way. If all financial institutions join forces, it will become much easier to gain access to such data, but we're not there yet. Of course, for the short term, there is a concern that we might lose this large customer, a wealthy customer, to our competitor. But over the long term, we need to go hand in hand with our customers. If they don't reduce their emissions, then they may end up spending more money on paying carbon tax or purchasing emission permits, which will have a negative impact on their financial statements. If these companies take up a large portion of our bank's portfolio, then our bank's sustainability will also suffer. So, over the long term, working together with our customers is the right direction we should be headed. In the past, under the Kyoto Protocol, the situation was a bit different. Korea's position was that Korea was neither advanced country nor a developing country. We claimed that we were in between, but in fact, Korea was on par with advanced countries in terms of their emissions. But back then, Korea did not want to acknowledge it. I have been following the UNFCCC for more than 20 years now, and while we were under the Kyoto Protocol, things were quite fuzzy. Korea was neither an advanced country nor a developing country. It was quite awkward for Korea to take a definite position between the two. Then advanced countries would challenge us. Korea, what's your position? But Korea was still neither here or there. So, what I'm trying to say is that in order to avoid repeating the same mistakes, the government needs to present a clear vision from a longer term perspective. Of course, you need the consent of the legislature in order to make laws and regulations, but with respect to finance in particular, to advance green finance or to assist financial institutions in climate risk assessment, availability of data is critical. The government has a large database, but it is very conservative when it comes to its utilization. The government has our own difficulty because when we request data from companies, then the companies reject our request, saying that it's their trade secret. But is greenhouse gas emission a trade secret? No, because greenhouse gas doesn't tell you anything about the industrial process itself. Recently, there were some media reports saying Korean companies have huge emission liabilities, which will grow to thousands of billions of won in a few years' time. In fact, Korea has accounting standards, a guideline on emission liability, co-developed by FSS and the Ministry of Environment. However, companies are not strictly following these standards. For example, they only record emission liabilities against which they have to purchase emission permits. They do not record the proceeds from the sale of the emission allowance. To an outsider, this company looks like carrying liabilities only. So just last week, I had a meeting with FSC and FCC, and we agreed to make these standards more granular and specific so that companies report the amount of their allowance, emission proceeds from the sale of their allowance, etc. Only the total amounts are reported for provisions or income, so you don't know what they consist of. Or on the liability side, emission liabilities are recorded transparently, but on the income side, only the total amount is revealed. If we can provide more specific guidelines for reporting the minimum amount of data required, it will allow financial institutions to get a better grasp of the basic information. Also, for the kind of data that may not be as critical as a trade secret, then it can be made available by processing the raw data so that it can be used for policymaking. If we can make improvements in the institutions in this way, it will be extremely useful. With regard to infrastructure, you talked about the institutional infrastructure. I think the top priority should be the national net zero goal because it will eventually filter down to the real economy. And then we need to look at the financial system. IMF is supporting the idea of carbon taxation. BIS, in its Green Swan report, called for an overhaul of the entire financial system. In Korea, too, FSC has announced its green finance promotion policy earlier this year. According to this policy, government-invested banks are also required to put in place green finance organization to boost their financial performance. Climate risk supervisory framework is being introduced to promote green finance in the private sector. Taxonomy is being developed. There are disclosure requirements being prepared and introduced. However, these are all individual, separate programs. So what we need is a more integrated or harmonized action plan or roadmap like EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. Since we have no representation from regulatory authorities today, let me ask this question to KB. What was the biggest hurdle for KB in declaring net zero, and how did you overcome it? As was mentioned by Mr. Sang Chun-han earlier on, disclosure is key. As a financial institution, we assess loan applications from companies, and the thing is all their data transparent and consistent? Is it available to all stakeholders? Unfortunately, this is not quite happening. In case of other financial institutions, for example, at Shinhan Financial Investment, they would create a basket of external ratings such as MSCI and TJSI. They would combine 7 to 8 ratings on a weighting basis to assess creditworthiness of the companies. At KB Securities, we combine external ratings with the qualitative assessment by our analysts for click adjustment. At KB Bank, we are working with Korea Corporate Governance Service to develop a rating model. So basically, large enterprises talk about ESG and climate risks, but small and medium-sized companies are totally in the dark. So we are trying to build a model that can help them to assess and improve the situation. To achieve net zero on the national level, we have to ensure access to data and data transparency, which will further facilitate our loan assessment process. So this is what we need. But on the working level, many companies still worry about assessment. They are afraid to see their assessment result and try to avoid it. But things will gradually improve as there is increasing awareness and consensus about this data issue. Secondly, what we need is standardized classification system. Currently, the Ministry of Environment is working on K taxonomy. We joined EU taxonomy last year. We joined one of its working groups where we brought our SME loan data and ran the data to assess whether it was green or not. This year, we're in phase 2 of the working group and focusing on more details of the work. I'd like to take this opportunity to make a request to FSC and the Ministry of Environment who are working on the draft K taxonomy. It would be great if the authorities invite private sector financial institutions like KB or Shinhan to participate in the trial run of the system with their own datasets. Ideally, the national classification system should be developed with the participation of the private sector to ensure full effectiveness. So again, I ask the ministry to give us a chance to participate in the pilot run of K taxonomy. Also, another aspect of our net zero initiative we're trying to focus within our organization is that we are thinking of how to internalize this initiative. The media has been very vocal about this issue, the net zero issue. So we tend to think that there is strong consensus about this issue in our society. However, if we look at our customers or our own employees, has it really taken root as part of our culture? That's not necessarily the case. So what we financial institutions can do is to try to engage more customers by developing diverse ESG products and establish this as our corporate culture. So we're working very hard. So Mr. Han, instead of scolding us too much, could you say a few words of encouragement for us? Right. We have a very important meeting, COP26, coming up this year, and ESG is increasingly becoming a hot topic in the Korean society. Indeed, there is a lot of media coverage about the climate crisis and the need for considering ESG in our society. I see this happening as someone who's working in the media industry. As was mentioned by KB with regard to the provision of corporate data, this can be done very efficiently once the government introduces reporting requirements. Therefore, there is a certain role that the government can play in terms of the product or output. There's certainly a limitation to what the private sector can do. But it is also true that we have to take advantage of the strong momentum that is being created in the private sector because we don't want it to be wasted, right? Now that we have two speakers representing the leading financial institutions in this field, I'd like to ask this question to them. Recently, financial institutions are setting up ESG committees in order to highlight their social responsibility effort. To ensure its objectivity, a group of external experts are invited to sit on the ESG committees. Also, the ESG committees are used as an effective tool for promoting FI's ESG effort and also for developing new financial products to create profits in ESG space. So the committee serves multiple purposes. I understand the financial regulators are doing their part. So I promise that the press will also do its part. The new CEO of the Korea Economic Daily, Mr. Jung-ho Kim, is also very much interested in this area. So I give you my word here that my company will also support the efforts of the financial industry. It is not an easy task for a financial institution to achieve net zero. It's because it cannot do it alone, but has to work together with the real economy and the industry. I have a question for the Ministry of Environment. It seems that we need a huge transformation. Could you please share your wisdom as to how we should move ahead? As I said earlier, what's more important is the accurate direction. As Mr. Han and other speakers rightly pointed out, that the journey we're taking isn't going to be over with the current administration. The journey has to go on at least for another 30 years and beyond that, even. And in order to be successful, the government should set us on the right path. Based on what we have experienced in the past, it's very important for Korea to understand its position in the international community. Korea is an advanced economy and it is advanced in every other way. This means that Korea now has a greater responsibility, and now that it has set its net zero goal, the government should no longer rely on the industry cutting emissions here and there, but rather it should try to gather support from all sectors to work together toward net zero. Financial sector, industrial sector, and the government should all work together to achieve the net zero goal. At the Ministry of Environment, our motto or slogan is 2050 net zero starts right here for myself. So this means that it has to start immediately, and it cannot be done by the government alone, by the industry alone, or by the citizens alone. Of course, everyone understands that the industry understands that net zero is the right direction. It's just that since it's a very challenging journey, they're saying they need guidance. So the government should provide support to the industry and raise awareness among the citizens. And that's why internalization, that was previously mentioned, is extremely important. Can we achieve net zero by 2050 just by cutting emissions from the industry side? No. If we think about all the products that we use in our daily lives, where do they come from? A lot of greenhouse gases are emitted in the process of manufacturing them. So we have to mainstream the net zero goal in our society, in all aspects of our society. Of course, certain things can be achieved by laws and regulations, but we definitely need internalization effort to change the culture. And this is where collaboration with the government is critical, especially when it comes to finance. I have been working in finance for a long time, and I have been working very hard for the advancement of green finance in Korea. So I can confidently say that if we can gain access to the right data and utilize the data, share the data, so that we can move to a low carbon society, then I think that's a good thing. So the Ministry of Environment, the Financial Supervisory Service or Financial Services Commission should work together to build an institutional foundation where such critical data can be made available more easily. I would like to tell you what UNEP is doing. I would like to share with you what I have felt while working at the UN Global Steering Committee. UNEP FI is pushing for net zero with a tremendous sense of responsibility. It, it created a Net Zero Banking Alliance. Over a relatively short period of time, 43 financial institutions joined the alliance as founding signatories in April. I would like to share what I have felt with these net zero initiatives. Risk database and risk scenarios and analysis tools, and human resources, the experts who have been working in this field 10, 15 years. So in those three aspects, UNEP is very much ahead of us. This is what I felt. But as was mentioned by Director Kim, the international community is asking a lot of the Asian region, in particular Korea and Japan. there are higher expectations for Korea and Japan. So I hope that occasions like the Asia Regional Roundtable should be organized more often so that we can have active discussion about how regulatory authorities and financial institutions can work together to move ahead. KB was lucky to make a head start, but other financial institutions need some guidance. That's why I keep asking UNEP to share with us best practices and benchmarks. So by organizing events like this, I hope that more information can be shared, information on specific approaches like carbon measurement methodologies and climate scenarios for emission reductions. Indeed, UNEP is developing a number of programs to do this. Mr. Taeung-nim, as Korea representative of UNEP, what's your take on this? UNEP is leading the Net Zero Initiative and Net Zero Alliance, which was just mentioned, and conducting pilot projects in banking, insurance, and investment with TCFD. Korean financial institutions, especially UNEP signatories among them, are taking the lead in this space, at least in the Asia Pacific region. And Korean regulators, especially Financial Services Commission, FSC, hosted a session last year on climate risk management with other regulatory authorities in the region participating, and FSC delivered a presentation there. I strongly believe that Korea can be a model country for the Asia Pacific region in the field of climate finance as well. As the majority of UNEP members are financial institutions from Europe and North America, there are not many programs focused specifically on Asia. So I think we need to develop the regional programs further. All of our speakers here today are setting out on a net zero journey together. Could you share with us your final thoughts? What's your advice for financial institutions in Korea and in the region regarding climate risk management and net zero target? Maybe Mr. Kim from KB, go ahead first. I read an article recently which said it's important to pursue ESG, but what's more important is to strike a balance between the values lost and gained due to ESG. The article said we need to have a sense of balance. So instead of just blindly pursuing the net zero goal in a hasty manner, I think it's important to make preparations step by step. KB's approach is three-pronged. First, strategy. We have set up a committee under which there are 3 task force units. Task Force 1 is developing climate risk management strategy for KB. The effort is currently underway. Second, in Task Force 2, we are focusing on products. We're working on developing new products that can draw customer attention to ESG while providing attractive returns. So we are trying to develop ESG products. Last but not least, Task Force 3 is working on internalization. We have a campaign called KB Green Wave 2030 going on, which sets forth 3 important rules. They are no plastic, less paper, and save the energy. And we're building a corporate culture around them. It's important to set up a committee, but it alone cannot bring a real challenge. So in making preparations, we need to focus on setting the right direction and align our strategy, products, and culture with that direction. Again, I'd like to emphasize that the system being developed by the government or the Ministry of Environment should be tested with a large volume of data provided by the private sector before it is actually put to use. Thank you. Director Kim? Yes, we will make sure to test K taxonomy along with the private sector as soon as it is completed. Unless the needs of its users are reflected, the system will be useless. So I assure you the testing with the private sector will be done. Well, Mr. Lim has served as Korea representative of UNEP and led green finance in Korea, and I myself also have experience working at the UN for about 3 years. And what I have realized is that Korea attracts much attention on the global stage, unlike in the past. When Korea speaks, other countries pay attention. This means that depending on how we set the agenda, there is an opportunity for Korea to lead the global discussion, or at least in Asia Pacific. In fact, Korea is the only country in the world that has a nationwide carbon trading system. Now, the second round of carbon trading is over, and during such a short period of time, Korea has quickly overcome many problems that the EU has experienced and entered a stable stage, which is another great accomplishment. So, Korea has a lot of best practices by now to share globally, or at least in this region. And in doing so, there is a possibility, I think, that Korea's proposals may be adopted as global standards if those proposals are good. Since you are with UNEP, I hope you will organize such opportunities to promote Korea and Korean companies and financial institutions who are leading in this field. So I hope to see more of such occasions where Korea can promote its best practices. Thank you. Yes, when I think about climate finance, I imagine antelopes along the Masai Mara River in Africa. The first antelope that jumps into the river becomes almost always the lunch for alligators. If financial institutions jump in together, they can all live. But for the first mover, there is a certain level of danger. Fortunately, financial institutions these days are turning more positive toward ESG and has a will to pursue climate finance. It's just that they don't know how. We heard many good ideas today from Chief Writer Mr. Han, with some admonitions, of course, also from Director Kim. Thank you for your advice and ideas. As I said earlier, in climate finance, KB and Shinan are not competitors. We are partners. So I hope that we will have more opportunities to work together going forward. Yes, could you say a few words to wrap up? Today we discussed a lot about Korea's net zero policy and the role of financial institutions. There were many good ideas about the potential roles that Korea can play in the Asia Pacific region. I hope that what we have discussed in today's session will be helpful, not only to the attendees, but also to everyone who will watch this video. With that, we conclude this session. Thank you very much.